Welcome to the February webinar with PI Education and Pursuit magazine. I'm Kim Green, housewife and the managing editor of Pursuit. I'm here today with Ellen McGarrahan. Is that right? Is that how you pronounce your name?
That's exactly right. Yeah.
With Ellen McGarrahan, she worked for a decade as a reporter at newspapers in Miami, New York, and San Francisco, left journalism and became a private investigator in the 1990s. And now she runs her own PI firm and is the author of an incredible new book that I have just finished. It's called Two Truths and a Lie: A Murder, a Private Investigator, and Her Search for Justice. I finished this book today, Ellen, by the way, and what a journey this is for the reader. I mean, obviously, like, it's a multi-layered journey on your part. In physical space, you went to Australia, Ireland, a crazy weekend in the wilds of Washington. It's a journey back in time to a terrible moment when a crime occurred. And it's kind of a journey into your own experience of maybe disillusionment and wisdom about the nature of truth and justice. That's my take anyway. You'll probably have a different take, but it's also an incredible journey for the reader. I cannot recommend it enough. I'll hold this up and wave it around many more times. This is only the first time, but welcome, Ellen.
Thank you so much. And thank you for those very kind words. I think you captured it amazingly well. I'm honored.
We're honored that you're with us today. You probably are on the interview circuit right now. You're getting a lot of great press for this book. I've seen a mention of it in the New York Times, a rave review in the Washington Post. I'm not sure where else, but people are really paying attention. How does that feel?
It feels really amazing. There's a wonderful review on Fresh Air yesterday as well. And it's just my experience of having lived with this story for a really long time and now sharing it. I think one of my questions was how it would connect. And, it's kind of a private mystery that I've had that I really needed to solve. And it's been really remarkable to know that it's something that connects as well with a community and a group of readers that I care a huge amount about who are interested in the issues in the book.
Well, and I think private investigators, which is our audience, that I think they're going to read this in a completely different way. We'll get into that a little bit later in this hour, but PIs are going to read this and journalists are going to read this in a really different way than, the general public, because some of the things that you learn along the way are things that private investigators also learn in their work, just about how hard the truth is to pin down sometimes, and that the crime show television version of justice just isn't real. That's old news for the people watching right now, but not for a lot of your readers. So that's kind of part of the journey that we get to see. So why don't we begin, if you don't mind, would you take us back to kind of the opening part of your book, but the beginning of this whole story for you? 1990, you're a young reporter in Florida, and you get this assignment to witness an execution. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that is really where the story starts. I volunteered to witness it. I was a young reporter in the Miami Herald's Capitol Bureau. I'd been there about 4 months. I was the youngest person there. I was also the only woman. And part of my beat was covering the Department of Corrections. And as a sort of a routine part of the Capitol Bureau reporting life was that the governor would sign death warrants. And when that happened, the city desk would ask if there was anybody who was available to cover it. And I put my hand up. I didn't expect actually that it would go through, because not every warrant does, as we know. And particularly at that time, my bureau chief had never witnessed an execution, and he'd been there for 7 years. So I felt pretty safe in saying, yes, I will do this. But then it happened really fast, actually. And I found myself driving over to Stark, which is where Florida State Prison is and where the execution took place.
Do you mind sharing a little bit about what that experience was like? Actually, it wasn't what you expected.
That's Yeah, it's really true. The Florida at the time was using the electric chair, and there are quite a number of other reporters in the Capitol press building. There was a 3-story building that in Tallahassee where all of the newspapers had their offices. And so I talked to a large number of people who actually had witnessed executions, and they gave me an idea of what was going to happen that turned out to be very different from what happened to during the execution that I witnessed. I actually have the newspaper story here. It's something that, to give you an idea of what a central part it's played in my life. I still have a clip of it. And what happened is that when they turned on the electricity that morning, there was a faulty sponge in the headpiece, which caught fire. And so the man that I saw executed was named Jesse Tefero, and I watched as the headpiece that was strapped to his head burst into flame. And the prison, they turned the execution. Sorry, I always get flustered when I talk about this. I apologize, but I will go ahead and get through it. They turned the electricity off, and I could see him breathing. And then they turned it back on again, and there were flames and smoke again. And they turned it back off, and he was still breathing. And then when they turned it on for a third time after 13 minutes, that's when he was declared dead at 7:13. So I think he actually was 6 or 7 minutes. I'm messing that up. I apologize. But in any case, it was much longer than the usual 1 minute, 1 jolt circuit of electricity that I had thought I was going to see. And, to be honest, I don't know how an ordinary execution would have affected me. It's entirely possible it would have affected me as much. But I remember as we were leaving the death chamber, one of the reporters who was there, who was an AP reporter who I think had seen over a dozen executions, in the prison van as we were leaving, he spoke up. Everyone was very silent. He spoke up and he said, "What was that?" And at that point, that's when I knew that there was something that had gone wrong, which I think sounds a little bit odd to say, but it all happened. It was so violent, really, and it was also so just immediate that I didn't have time to think about it as I was watching it. I just took my notes, and then it was only afterwards that when Ron Word asked that question, that's when I thought, oh, wow, and I think that's when it really started to sink in.
I guess in a sense, what we may have forgotten is that just as a culture, it's an extraordinary thing, no matter what the ending of a life.
Yeah.
And it just so happened that you witnessed one that was even more extraordinary in its violence and horror. And in your book, you admit this awakened a ghost and changed your life. Can you tell us about that? I mean, I can just tell by the way you're talking about it right now that this was so long ago, and it still affects you so much that it's hard to talk about. You still don't seem to have distance from it. So will you tell us how that changed your life?
Yeah, and I feel a little embarrassed about that. I know I should have a much smoother account of it. Just every time I can. I think it changed my life in a lot of different ways. One of the ways that it made me immediately think about life and death, which sounds, pretty trite, but it was also like very immediately like, oh, okay, wow, at some point then this life thing ends and then that's it. And so I was 26 and I hadn't possibly given a huge amount of thought to the larger questions. It isn't that I hadn't thought about them at all. I just maybe thought they didn't really apply to me, as younger people tend to do. And so I started looking at my life in a different way, which is, okay, so it's not then infinite, it's definitely finite. And what are the choices that I'm making now, and how do they matter to me? And then a couple of months after the execution, I was assigned to cover a serial killer in Gainesville, Florida, who had murdered students at the beginning of the University of Florida's term there. And I think that was, combined with the execution, was probably a little bit too much for me. And I stopped believing in something that I had truly treasured up until then, which is the idea that writing and reporting the truth is something that is can kind of change things or speak truth to power and all of that. That just kind of, it seemed a little bit less effective, having witnessed these really terrible things, and certainly been part of the fear that was in Gainesville then. It was a town that was really gripped by fear, and it ended up just kind of snowballing for me, I think. And I covered the state. One of my beats was covering the state Senate, the Florida State Senate, and that next election, or that next Senate term, I just was listening to those guys just talk about, the legislative. It's important, but it can feel like inside baseball. And I just was listening to those guys and thinking, what does this actually have to do with my two huge kind of questions about life and death? And I realized it really, for me, it really didn't. And then I just thought, okay, well, I'm out of here. And I moved to California back in the day when that was possible to do without already having a job and, everything set up. San Francisco was still the left coast then, kind of the foggy far reaches of the country. It was as far as you could go, really, without just sliding directly into the Pacific Ocean. And so I went out there and I thought, well, we'll see. And it's a way to start over.
Which takes us right into a big life change you made at some point after the experiences you're describing. You leave journalism and eventually become a private investigator. Tell us that story, and does that connect to what you experienced? Is there a cause-effect relationship there?
I don't know. Let me think about that for a little second. I think that it's a really natural transition from journalism to private investigation. It's a really, really similar skill set, and it felt like a way to use the skills that I had in a slightly different realm. And also, this was in the mid-1990s. Journalism was beginning to change. And so it felt like a way to continue to do the work, but in an industry that was changing pretty quickly, and becoming sort of less of the stable sort of job career path that I had thought it was when I first started out. At that point, I'd been working as a journalist for about 10 years. And in San Francisco, there's a tradition of non-traditional detectives, people who don't have police backgrounds, who just can use whatever other skills that you can bring to the profession to work. And so I had a friend who was a journalist, who was a stringer for a paper, and he was working for a detective agency that wanted to hire a woman. A woman had just left. They were looking for another woman. And I just signed up for it. And when I first started doing it, I thought, this is just definitely not for me. And so it's always that, experience that you have where you think, nope. And then I just kept doing it. And I realized that my first impression was completely wrong, that it was something that really worked really well. And I think it was a good way to be able to use all the skills and then also obviously learn new ones, because it's not exactly the same job at all. And so that was a challenge too. Begin to feel like there was new stuff on the horizon.
Right. Well, what were some of the parts of your reporting skills and also of your personality that did translate well to the PI work?
I knew how to interview people and write. So, and write on deadline. Those were kind of the basic things. And I think the way that it did kind of touch back to the execution is that I had this new kind of belief that it was important to kind of see the world, to really see how people live and meet people living their lives and try to figure all of that out. I think in the book, I write about it as the sensation of being away. And that really felt true, from everything that I had known about the world. And it's a really, really excellent way to understand life. And that was something that was really appealing to me. And also to start over, because showing up on somebody's doorstep, as we know, it's just you, it's just them. There's this kind of perfect crystalline moment of connection. And that's something that I found to be something that it just was I wanted to do more of that. I wanted to meet more people and understand a little bit more about how all of us are getting through our days.
And, I don't know if you agree with this or not, but I've heard some people who've done both kinds of work before say that as journalists, they felt like they were outside of the stories they're telling. But as a private investigator, you're in it, you're a part of the story and driving the action sometimes. Do you agree with that or partially agree with that?
I totally agree with that. I wish I thought to say it. Actually, it really makes a lot of sense. Yeah, exactly. There is that sense of being involved in like the actual flow of something rather than judging it. And I think that it was also really interesting to me to not have to have opinions and judgments and reaching conclusions or trying to starting out with an idea and then seeing if it was possible to prove it out. One of the things I really liked and still like about investigation work is the importance of knowing all of the facts and the other side and understanding stories from all these different angles, which I realize journalists do too. It's not like it's separate, but investigation requires you to be able to, requires the idea of the other side that's over there that's going to be arguing against you. So you really have to make sure that you completely understand all aspects of everything. And that felt really freeing to me.
I want to read just one really quick quote from your book. And this relates to the question I just asked about skills that apply to both professions. And this is going to move us a little bit into the whole question of this hour, which is doggedness or obsession or all the different aspects of being of persistence. So I love this. You write, "You can patronize me, scold me, lie to my face, and I'll roll with it. But flat out telling me no, that word is a red cape and a bull ring to me." That's so interesting. I'm a little bit more of a shy person. I think I hear no a little bit more easily. So what is it about you that can't hear no? What happens inside you when somebody says no?
I just want to know what they're saying no about. It's just curiosity, I think. It really is very much like, okay, so why would you say no? What's the story? And it's interesting. It's actually an incredible asset, obviously, as an investigator, because people say no kind of a lot. And so then to have that not be a closed door, but more like an invitation to try to find out what that no is all about. I think it's just the way I'm wired. Honestly, I don't really know, but I don't really want to question it too much because it is a pretty human thing.
Because it's useful.
Yeah, very much so. It is.
So we're going to move kind of into the specifics of this story. You remember we talked about a part I wanted you to read. Do you have that ready to go?
I think so. Can you remind me exactly where it is?
It's page XXXI in the prologue.
Mm-hmm. I've got that here.
And then you go down to old murder cases and read that paragraph.
Okay, thank you. Old murder cases are like coffins, buried deep, holding a world of hurt. I knew this from the death row cases I'd worked on over the last 2 decades as a private eye. I wasn't going to lie to myself about it. You have to be careful opening them up. You may find things you cannot forget that you'll wish you'd never seen.
And then would you finish up by going to the bottom? I've tried to ignore the mystery and then finish the section. Would you mind doing that?
Thank you. I've tried to ignore this mystery, this misery, which has graced the edges of so many days, my unfinished story. I've tried to plead with it, to appease it, to surrender to it, to concede its points to it, to argue with it, and to bury it. But I keep waking up in the middle of it, this rattling echo, this old sorrow, these dead bones. I need it to go away and leave me alone. It never has. It will not. It has become part of you. There's only one way for that to no longer be true. I'm a private detective. This is a mystery. I know what I have to do, but I've never worked inside my own life before, never dared to face my own shadows, and I'm afraid of ghosts.
That is beautiful writing, first of all.
Thank you.
And that comes, future readers, that comes very early in the book. And if you can put this book down after you read that, then I don't even know who you are. But it's also, this is not a novel. This is your real life. And so it almost feels strange for me to say, this is gripping, this is beautiful writing, because we're talking about a story in which you chose to let a time of darkness into your life in a very big way and to live inside it. So bring us back into that case. How did, for years you maybe didn't think about that execution day quite so much, but then it came back into your world. Can you tell us how that happened, first of all?
About 2 years after Jesse Tafero was executed, his co-defendant who had been convicted on largely the same testimony, her conviction was overturned and she was released from prison on a plea deal. And that, of course, cast doubt onto the integrity of Jesse Tafero's conviction. And I was in California. I was working in construction as a tile setter. This is the sort of part of my life where I had thrown everything out the window and was starting over. And I turned on my television one day to watch 2020, and I saw this story flash on the screen. It was a story about Jesse Tafero and his co-defendant, Sonny Jacobs, and their friend whose testimony had put them in he put both of them on death row, about whether or not the friend who testified against them was actually the murderer and Jesse and Sonny were innocent. And so I saw that television show and I froze, and it really came back into my life then. I mean, I suppose in some ways it hadn't left, but it really kind of became like something that I was thinking about a lot. And then over the next 20 years or so, 10 years, I'm sort of bad at math, 10, 20 years, something like that, 10 years. There were really a lot of news reports about Jesse and Sonny and Walter and innocence. And I just saw a lot of them, they were in my environment and I was really thinking about it. Every time I would read his name, I would kind of sort of flash back, and so that's kind of how the memory stayed with me. And so I can tell
why don't you tell take us to the story of the crime itself. And then when you give us that basic story, then we can move into how you decided to reinvestigate it.
So the crime happened on February 20, 1976. It was in a rest area on the side of Interstate 95 in Broward County, Florida, some miles north of Fort Lauderdale. Jesse Tafero, his girlfriend, Sonny Jacobs, and their friend, Walter Rhodes, and two young children were asleep in a car in the rest area. And two police officers, Florida Highway Trooper Philip Black and his friend, a visiting Canadian constable named Donald Irwin, knocked on the window and they were shot dead. And the Tafero and Jacobs and Rhodes were very quickly arrested. And Walter Rhodes turned state's evidence, and he said that Jesse and Sonny had shot the officers. Jesse and Sonny said Walter did it. Walter testified against them, his testimony was a huge part of sending them both to death row. And then about a year later, he recanted, and he said he had committed the crime himself. And then he recanted the recantation, and then he confessed again, and then he recanted the recantation, and then he confessed again. And then he recanted the recantation, and then he confessed again, and then he recanted. So I believe it was in 1982. That was his last series of confessions and recantations. So at that point, we're 6 years after the murders. And that was probably one of the really main questions, obviously, about whether the conviction had integrity, was the confessions and the recantations of the main eyewitness against them. There were other eyewitnesses. He wasn't the sole person who was at the rest area who was able to testify. There were two truck drivers who were also there who testified about what they saw. But there's just no doubt that his word was really important to the state's case. And then
So go ahead.
and then Sunny, she was her case was overturned on appeal in 1992, and she had an Alfred plea and was basically released with time served.
A lot of people watching probably know what an Alfred plea is, but why don't you just go over it again in case someone doesn't?
It's a guilty plea in which the person admits that the state can prove certain facts against them, but doesn't admit guilt.
Right. Okay. So you you dove into this reinvestigation, not necessarily all at once, and I can't remember quite all the details, but it just, this ghost kept popping up, right? And it wouldn't quite leave you. So kind of just tell us how you ended up either diving in by choice or being dragged in, or however you would characterize that
I think
process.
it's probably both. The thing that I really couldn't leave behind was, the headline on my story said 3 jolts used to execute killer. So if Jesse Tafera was innocent, that's a really different headline, and so I had to try to understand my own, like what I'd seen. I needed to know that for myself. And also at the Florida State Prison, the morning of the execution, Sister Helen Prejean was beginning her march against the death penalty. And she talked to us reporters afterwards. And one of the things, I was in, I think, a bit of distress. And I asked her, after I interviewed her, I was raised Catholic, and I asked her, what do I do as me, not as the Miami Herald, but as me. And she said, you have to bear witness. And so I carried that too, like, okay, so what did I see then if I'm bearing witness? And it just was something, as when I read the stories, there was things in the news stories that, and the case was made into a play called The Exonerated, which is a really beautiful piece of writing. And it's very, very emotionally effective work. It really is. But there were aspects of the way that the case was being reported that didn't match what I knew from having read the old case files back in from the initial news stories in 1976. And so I think if it had been a case of just reading about it and realizing, oh, wow, having to come to terms with that, but there were just enough questions there. And I had become a private investigator where my entire job was to go out and try to find out what actually happened in any situation, like the whole story, not just the easy pieces, that I just ended up really needing to know. And I tried really hard to put it aside, because who in the world in their right minds would go and investigate a murder that happened on the side of a highway in a rest area that had long since been torn down 40 years ago? That's just, a really pretty monumental task. But once I decided to do it, I realized I actually had a professional background as an investigator with a lot of experience going back into the past in a really far into the past in a really complicated way. It ended up being something that I did quite a bit as part of my practice. And I thought, okay, well, I was a witness. I have to bear witness. There's a lot of these different questions. I have the skill set. I have a ghost. I have to do this. And that's where I ended up.
This is a very woo-woo bizarre question, but what was the ghost? Was the ghost the image of Jesse in the chamber? Was the ghost the questions that arose about his guilt or complicity, or was it something completely inside your brain?
I think it was him. There was a moment when he was brought into the death chamber, and the guard teams between 2 guards, and they had to turn him around to make him look at the electric chair. And he looked at the electric chair, and he really startled. And, in a way, that was the hardest thing about the entire witnessing experience, was seeing his realization, looking at the chair, that this was actually happening. And I think that that's something that I just, in that moment, I think I could maybe possibly, I don't know if it was empathy or sympathy or curiosity or
humaneness. Just
Humane.
you're
Yeah.
seeing another human suffering, you know, whether, and maybe there don't even have to be questions of who deserves what. When you see a human suffering terribly,
Yeah.
and it's connected to a tragedy in which many other people suffer, you can't help but feel something. If you yourself are human, that's how I think about it. And maybe
Yeah.
that's part of the ghost. I don't know.
Well, I think so, definitely. And also in the interim, I had gone and worked. I worked briefly. I worked on a number of death row cases, and I was a staff investigator for a little bit of time at the Habeas Corpus Resource Center in California. So I had spent time working on death penalty cases, and I also that also made me want to understand not just what had happened with Jesse Tefero, but also very much what happened with Trooper Black and Constable Irwin. I wanted to know the whole thing, because I knew that the way that my story connected with, what happened at Stark and then what happened in the rest area, that there were all these different pieces, that it wasn't for me actually just about the guilt or innocence of the three people who were at the rest area, but also what had happened with the officers, and all the different ways in which you end up, and it's specifically or perhaps particularly in a capital murder case, there's all this incredible web of connections, the interconnections of all of it. And I think that was part of the ghost too, that it wasn't just one person, it was these events and the way in which that we are all carrying the story in some way together. I just needed to know what the story actually was.
That's a beautiful way to say it. I can almost imagine the images of the troopers tagging along behind you on this quest, and their families, and the trucker witnesses at the rest stop, and everyone whose happiness has been diminished, or who has experienced this tragedy from up close or from afar. They're all kind of with you in the room as you go on this incredible journey that's darkness and light all in one, in a strange way. But back to you as an investigator, and I think everybody here can probably identify with this. When you get into a really complicated case, it's messy. And one of the ways that you describe it is that it's this picture that in places is pixelated, and you want to put those into focus, and there's something really satisfying about that and thrilling. I want to read another passage I really liked. So this is you describing the feeling of discovery and what that's like. There's something in investigation that is close to a chemical reaction. It's a flash, a sting. It's rare because most things are easy to find, and it's addictive, this jolt in the breastbone that comes only from finding something given up for lost. What a beautiful way to describe that feeling that I bet everybody here can relate to. That the pleasure of fully engaging in something, giving yourself totally to it, and then finding something in the process. It's almost like a flow state, I would think. Maybe one that you can only achieve if you really live inside a case, maybe to the point of obsession. So tell us a little bit about that flow state, the good part of that sort of doggedness, persistence, the feeling of obsession. And then next we're going to move into maybe if there's a dark side of that.
It's just a really interesting point. And I hadn't thought of it as a flow state, but you're exactly right. It's the time when you can look at a banker's box full of files and just go through them and almost, you read them, sort them, parse them all in one moment, when every single fact that you have is at your fingertips, where you can make connections. You're like, oh yeah, I remember that. That was that's something that I think you do end up living. I dreamed this. It woke me up in the middle of the night. I didn't watch television probably for a year and a half, because I just, I had this movie playing constantly in my head. And so I think that that is something that's that comes from full immersion. I will say too, though, that I think it's something that like investigators do all the time, in a lot of different cases. I know that even on like a really boring or routine case that I do now, if I'm really, you find something and you're kind of just following it and you're following it, and you want the answer. It's the wanting of the answer, I think, that brings that state about, where you really care what it is and you really want to find it. And it can be, an asset search. It doesn't have to be something that's completely, literally life and death. I think it's what makes investigators is that we would do this in, no matter what, it's kind of a way of being in the world. And so that zing, though, really is something when you are fully involved and you see it and you find it, and it's really, it actually is pretty addictive, I think.
And by the way, I just, a message popped up here. I want to say a familiar name to you. Johnnardisi says hi.
Tell John I said hi. Hi, John.
And he says that you work together. Ellen and I work together as PIs in San Francisco. Her book shows how a detective thinks, feels, and works better than anything I've ever read. She's tops.
Thank you, John. And John is an amazing writer. I've always been incredibly jealous of John. I was reading his investigative reports back in the day going, well, now, why can't I do that? So that's huge praise. Thank you very much.
Yes, we love him as a writer too. He's written for Pursuit several times, and anytime I see his name pop up in my inbox, I get very, very happy.
Yeah.
Before we go into the, a little bit of the dark personal side of how it is to live a case like this, can you share just a little bit of, just give us a sense of how deep into this you went? I mean, you went to Australia, you went to the middle of nowhere in Ireland, as much of that as you feel comfortable telling without giving too much away. Just how many thousands of hours did you spend on this? How many miles did you put on the soles of your shoes? How many people did you talk to?
It was a lot. My goal was to talk to every single person who was there at the rest area that morning in 1976. And I was really lucky, and also to read every single piece of paper I could find about it. That's kind of my, read everything, talk to everyone and read everything approach. And it ended up being pretty lucky in that in the court files, in the county court files, there was a list of, there's a stack of affidavits that had been submitted on behalf of Jesse Tefero on his appeal in 1989. And they were great statements from people. They were really detailed, and they were there right in the court file. That was the place that I started. And so as I said, what I wanted to do was to just talk to everyone, sort of travel back in time and find out the retired police officers, the friends, of all three of Jesse Tefero, Sonny Jacobs, and Walter Rose, to try to talk to everybody who knew them back then. That was my goal, was to get back to the instant when the shots rang out at the rest area. So I read every single piece of paper I could find, and I talked to every single person I could find. And that took me from Florida to Ireland to Australia, and sort of West Virginia, North Carolina, like a bunch of other states too. And I ended up working on the case for a full year. Started in January, and my last interview was in December. And it was really an interesting thing to do, because what I had started out with and what I ended up with were two completely different places. And when that happens, that's always such an interesting experience. I had thought really that it was going to be pretty simple, because I thought I would just go down there and read the court records and talk to maybe some of the officers who responded. But it pretty quickly branched out into a case that involved the non-professional or quasi-professional cocaine scene in Florida in the 1970s. And those guys were pretty interesting. And they were also, the benefit of 40 years having passed is that they were, willing to talk. I don't think that it would have been necessarily possible to do that investigation, for example, in 1977. But in 2015, which is when I did it, it was kind of getting, asking people to talk about the old days. And that can be a lot easier than talking about something that's just happening, or that is, sort of in people's life in the present. But of course, it also meant asking people to talk about something that was very difficult for them in a lot of ways. And so that's also an obstacle, I guess, a challenge, but also it was difficult for me too. And I think that's one thing that was helpful in the interviews, is that I wasn't coming in from the outside. I actually, as a witness, had an actual role that,
Right.
was kind of part of the journeys. People on the doorstep asked me, why are you interested in this? And I said, well, I witnessed Jesse Tafero's execution. And it was like, okay, then I had the right to know. And I think that really was a help, because there was a solemnity there. And there was also really a sense of just finally talking about it. I spent, some of my interviews were 6 hours long. We just sat and talked, because as we know, inside a case has its own language. It has its own shorthand. So if you can say to somebody, well, what about the angle of the bullets? And you know what you're talking about. It's like, it's a connection. And if you haven't been able to speak that language with somebody, it's a relief to do it. And I think that was something that was really a really extraordinary experience. And it made me realize that all the years I've been carrying this story, I wasn't alone. And that was pretty profound for me, actually. And it definitely helped me to know that.
That is a very strange and fascinating kind of therapy.
Yeah.
To go and knock on the doors of, again, if this were a novel, it would be full of a fantastic cast of characters, jewel thieves, 70s drug dealers right out of Miami Vice, exploding boats, owners of clubs, maybe a former member of the Irish Republican Army. But this wasn't a novel. Again, this was you knocking on the doors of people who could be dangerous. So tell me about you've started into this, but tell us a little bit about, in the book, you're pretty transparent about times when you knocked on a door and were terrified and thought, maybe I shouldn't be knocking on this door. Maybe I shouldn't be visiting this strange little encampment in the wilds of Washington State. So do you mind sharing some times when you were a little concerned, maybe?
I probably should have been more concerned, but there's just this thing about going after the facts or after the truth that can possibly erroneously feel like a magic shield, I know. I do feel like that's part of investigation, is to step out of your known world and get into somebody else's. And of course, you really don't know what you're going to encounter. It wasn't really until I finished the investigation part and started writing it that I thought, maybe that wasn't the absolute smartest thing to do.
Will you share? Do you mind sharing just even one scene from somewhere in the book that isn't too much of a giveaway? Just a moment when, after the fact, you thought, why did I do that? Should I have done that?
Well, I guess the main one that seems to come up for people is in before I decided to do the case, that I was going to have to investigate it. I went and I talked to one of the possible murderers in a very, very isolated place in the woods. And I did that by myself, completely against the good advice of every single person who knows and loves me. I just was like, oh, I need to know this. And I think that was a confidence that but wait a second, I'm just going up there and I just need to ask this one question, which of course was, did you murder two police officers? But I just had the one thing that I really needed to know. And I thought, but it's just me and I got to talk. And it just felt like something that was possible. But I have thought in retrospect that was probably a decision that I wouldn't make again. I do it in a different way. I'm not saying I wouldn't do it, because I still would want to know and I still would want to ask. And I do truly, truly, truly believe in the power of asking questions. I think that we need to ask. There's nothing wrong with asking a question, and people can answer it however they want to. I don't think it wrecks anybody's life to be asked something if you do it in a respectful way. But I think there's probably more risks there than at the time. My need to know was so strong that I can just completely blew through those guardrails.
Well, and probably one of the people who may have objected to some of these things that you did was one of the heroes of your book is your husband or your partner, Peter.
Yeah.
And he really comes through as this incredible person who is absolutely supportive of you, but would probably kill on your behalf if he needed to, but unless you told him to stand down.
I don't think he would ever hurt anybody. Ever.
Well, anyway, he comes through as a wonderful person and as a figure in your life who loves you and is concerned for you, but also will not get in your way when you want and need something.
Well, he's also really amazingly intuitive and smart. It's really, really good to work with somebody who can see things that you don't see and can look at things a different way and say, oh, well, wait a second, like, what about this? There's a lot of times that happened in this case where, I had read probably 10,000 pages of documents, and I, was just looking at them, and I had my own way of looking at it. And he just would say, well, what about that? And of course, my first reaction is, well, what about that? Excuse me, I'm the one who's reading these documents, but it really can take like a new view. And also we all have different ways of looking at the world, and we have different sort of strengths as investigators. And so
he's your partner in your PI firm, correct?
Right. Yep.
Okay.
Yes, that definitely bears saying. He's not just wandering in, and pointing things out. And so I think that's always really interesting too, is that you can find new things with a new set of eyes. But yeah, I mean, and he did some of the road work. We did some of the road work in the book together. And
right. But then, what I'm getting to here is, back to the kind of question of obsession, the way you sort of, one of the ways that you define your level of obsession through the book is that at one point he was really starting to worry about you, that you were losing yourself in this.
Yeah.
So would you tell us a little bit about your changing mental state through this whole kind of psychological journey of reinvestigating the case? Were there moments when you did lose yourself, or you felt like you were in danger of it?
I think what happened to me is it was a trauma journey that I wasn't aware of, because it had never really occurred to me that watching somebody catch fire in an electric chair is a traumatic thing. I was a newspaper reporter, and it was a news event, and, we're just supposed to kind of move on. And I think that I had also worked as a death row investigator. And it's the same thing. You end up in a world that is a very, 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 very dark place. And I don't think we get enough education and training and compassion for each other or for ourselves about how to deal with those facts, because sometimes it really is impossible to just kind of say, well, that was a tough 9 to 5, but luckily it's 5:15 and that's all gone. It doesn't work that way. And I found, as I went deeper into this case, I found myself in the middle of really unexamined experiences that I had, from the execution to the Gainesville murders to working on death row cases. And at some point, it wasn't possible to just keep the door closed. I had opened it by walking back into this case, because every single time I did anything with the case, I ended up back in the death chamber again. I worked on this book for 6 years, and for probably 3.5 of those years, if I read Jesse Tafero's name, which I did a lot because he was in all the court documents, and I talked to a lot of people about him, I would start to tremble. Like you saw how at the beginning of this, I still can't really talk about the whole thing. So that was me. And then that's when I realized that, and Peter was very concerned. He was like, I think this is something that's, he could see it more than I could, because I was like, I just need to find these extra set of facts and I'll be fine. And he's like, no, I think you might need to deal with like the emotions around this, the feelings around this. And that's when I realized that I wasn't going to be able to just kind of think my way out of it and tough my way out of it. And I ended up working with EMDR therapy, which I found really, really effective. My brother-in-law had mentioned it to me because he experienced a death of somebody that he was close to at work, and it really threw him. And I saw how effective it was for him. And when I was really sort of struggling with this, having walked like straight into the middle of a 40-year-old murder case and absorbed, as we do, all of the emotions, all of the facts, all of the feelings, all of the complexities, all of the darkness of it. And then what was I doing with it? I was trying to write a book, which wasn't necessarily going that well. And so once I found EMDR, though, I realized that it was something that was possible to heal. It's not a talk therapy. It's a brain wiring therapy. You end up with memories that are kind of frozen in time. And if you integrate them, it's similar to REM sleep. You don't even have to say what you're thinking. You just really have to kind of just, do the work. And that was the thing that ultimately ended up being freeing for me, in addition to the work that I did on the book. And so I really feel every time I read now something in the paper, the terrible things that happen, and people say, I can't get over it, or I can't stop seeing it. I think, well, there is actually a therapy that actually works for this. And I feel like it would be really terrific to be able to talk a little bit more about that and not have it viewed as, well, I'm tough, I can handle it. Because
right. Wait, maybe that's part of handling it. Toughness is knowing what you need help with.
Yeah, and getting it. Yeah, that's really true. And it helps to have somebody on your side, as Peter was, to say, you think you're doing well with this, but this is something that is not working for you.
Right.
And that was really good.
Well, we have a question from Beth Carew. She said she wants to know, after you completed your research and discovered the answers to a degree, how long did it take you to write the book? What was the hardest part of the writing process?
That's a great question. Thank you. It took me 6 years, and the hardest part by far was writing about myself. I know I sound like I'm perfectly comfortable talking about myself, but as it's the word private is right there in the job description. I'm a private detective. Right. And so figuring out how to talk about myself in a way that felt relevant was the challenge. And I had to overcome, 20 years at that point, 25 years now, of strict professional training in not having, been being a blank slate, like that was hard. It's still hard.
I think that's what takes the book to a much deeper level. I mean, you're not just telling us what you did, what you discovered. You are reflecting, profoundly on how this affected you personally, and some of the feelings that you share, I guess some of them surprised me a little bit. Like, you talk not only about grief and about trauma, your own personal grief, but shame and guilt. That I didn't expect to hear, that you would have felt shame or guilt. You chose to dive into this incredibly difficult work, and one phrase that I wrote down that I thought was so interesting: the downside of trying, which to me is when you tackle something really complicated, difficult, painful, you allow darkness and the potential of failure into your life. So tell me about those really complicated feelings of shame and guilt. Why?
Yeah, I really tried to figure that out myself. I think that was in a period of time where I felt like I hadn't quite gotten to the end of the journey, where I felt like I'd asked a lot of the people that I was talking with, in particular, the family of Trooper Black, that I had brought this back to their doorstep, and I'd, knocked on doors all over the world, literally, because I needed to know, and it was almost like I'd woken this back up for everybody, and that wasn't easy, especially when I didn't know. I was struggling to try to figure out the answers. I wasn't all the way through that process. It's like, when it was like I was halfway or 3/4 of the way there. I just didn't know yet. And so I didn't know, what I was going to be able to do with it, whether it was going to be something that ultimately I was going to be able to make sense of. And so that was difficult. But I also think that, the middle of any case, the middle of any writing project can be very confusing. And so then if it's also a story that happens to be 20 years of your own life involving a brutal double murder and a botched execution, it just ended up being like having a lot of echoes. And it wasn't until I was able to really finish the investigation that eased up.
It sounds like the ghost wasn't going to leave you, that this was an obsession that you were going to have to act upon, or it was going to stick with you one way or the other. After the fact, as you look back on it, what was the cost to you of doing this, and what were the benefits? How do those balance out?
It balanced out really, really well, very highly in the benefit column in terms of the ghost, because the ghost is gone. I feel resolved, and I don't wonder anymore. And that's something that means a lot to me. And it's something like I needed to know this story for my own life, for my own understanding of my own path here on earth. And I feel like for me, I was able to understand that, and that's definitely worth it. And so I think ultimately that's something that so outweighs the difficulties of doing it. Just having that resolution. That I'm not sure I can sort of figure out if there is a final cost.
When I hear you say the answers, and one of the people asking questions said something about the answers, it isn't simple, these so-called answers. And I know we certainly don't want to offer any spoilers, but not all the pixelations got cleared up exactly, right? Did that end up being okay? I mean, at first, I'm sure like the version of Ellen that started this quest wanted all the pixelated areas to be clear. I'm not sure that exactly happened. You'll have to tell me whether you think that happened. Did you become a different Ellen who didn't have to have all the answers completely perfectly answered and the whole thing tied up in a bow?
I think bows are unrealistic in this sort of thing. And I think that I answered the most important question for myself in a way that felt completely resolved. And the fact that there were gray areas left, I think, is the nature of memory. It's the nature of life. It's the difficulty of not having been someplace, you can't go back to February 20th, 1976 at 7:33 a.m. in the morning. You have to do that through the memories of other people and through the documents. And so it's always going to be those, a puzzle that's made up of little tiny images that you put together. And I think that I really needed to know, I wanted to get back as close as I could to that. And the degree to which I was able to do that did feel resolved to me. But I think the complexities of the case, I think they share, it's a capital crime. These cases are complicated. The kind of, does a perfect case that gets completely resolved exist? I don't know. And so I did come to understand the nuances and appreciate them, and appreciate that they're probably inevitable. And it ended up being, completely fine for me to not necessarily feel like I gathered every single pixel.
I have a feeling that a lot of investigators who are watching this and who are going to read this are going to just be nodding along. Like, they all know already that these cases are complicated and that there are always pixels remaining, but the public doesn't know that. They're still seeing the TV version of justice where the bows exist. And so anyway, a commenter, Nicole Heiser, says, "Thank you for sharing your story. I've done capital mitigation and culpability investigations for more than 25 years, and hearing you speak has been a type of affirmation and validation of my own work."
Wow.
So
Thank you.
you're getting good reviews from fellow investigators, and they're the toughest crowd, I think.
It does mean a huge amount to me. Yes, absolutely. Because I know that we all would have done this case in some way, or, found, it would have been really, really amazing to be able to work on it with a whole group of people and figure out, all the different angles and kind of do a brainstorm about it. So that means a lot to hear. Thank you.
And we are just about at the end of the hour. I just want to wind up. First of all, I want to hold this amazing book up again. And tell us, I assume we can get this at all the usual places. Tell people how to get this book.
Well, you could definitely go to bookshop.org and support your local indie bookstore. I think that would be a really cool thing to do.
Excellent. And, one takeaway that I would love to leave with is, what would you like for people outside of this profession to know about how complicated cases are? It feels like there's almost this sort of, people are starting to talk about problems in criminal justice more. People are starting to talk about the death penalty and wrongful convictions, but there's still a little bit of a simplistic idea of what that really looks like. Like, someone's either guilty or innocent, and innocent people are being wrongfully convicted and this kind of thing, but it's so much more complicated. What do you hope this book will help people understand about how justice really works and what it should be?
I think that we need to look at the entire process and the entire system and understand the inequities and the injustices in it and move beyond innocence. I think innocence is really important, but the problems extend beyond that in terms of how just our system is, and that it's really important to be able to look at every aspect of a case and not just sort of there's a slight brass ring aspect to innocence, I think, in that I hope none of us believe that innocent people should be wrongfully imprisoned or executed, but we need to move the conversation beyond that to include everybody and include the entire system, and to look at ourselves too. I think that's something that really truly needs to happen and that we can start doing now.
Ellen, thank you so much for being with us again. Go get this book. While you're waiting for it to be delivered, you can go to Pursuit Magazine and read an excerpt that we just published today. And I just feel certain you're going to love it as much as I did. And we really appreciate your time today, Ellen. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a fascinating conversation.